You're 19 years old. You've never left the valley you were born in. Tonight, your father tells you that in 3 days, a group from the Eastern Band will arrive. Among them is a man you've never met. You will marry him. You've seen his people twice in your life, trading flint for dried fish at the river mouth. You don't know his voice. You don't know if he's kind. You know only that your mother once told you, "We don't marry our own blood. We marry the people who keep us alive." 3 days later, he arrives. And somehow this arrangement, cold, practical, decided by other people, is about to save both of your bands from extinction. Today, marriage feels like the most personal decision a person can make. You pick someone. You fall for them. You choose. But for most of human history, that's not remotely how it worked. So how did ancient humans actually decide who married who? The answer has almost nothing to do with love, and almost everything to do with survival. Let's start with the most basic rule, one so old it's baked into nearly every human culture on Earth. You don't marry your close relatives. This is called the incest taboo, and anthropologists have found some version of it in virtually every society ever studied. For a long time, people assumed this was purely biological, a hardwired instinct to avoid genetic problems in children. And there's truth to that. Inbreeding does increase the risk of harmful genetic conditions. But the taboo runs deeper than biology alone. It's also social engineering. Early human bands were small, usually somewhere between 20 and 50 people. If everyone married within the group, the band stayed isolated. No new alliances, no new knowledge, no backup if things went wrong. So instead, humans developed a system anthropologists call exogamy, marrying outside your own group. And this wasn't a suggestion. In many hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, it was an absolute rule, enforced by the entire community. This is where things get interesting, because exogamy wasn't random either. Many hunter-gatherer societies developed highly specific systems for who counted as an acceptable spouse. One of the most common is cross-cousin marriage, where you could marry your mother's brother's child or your father's sister's child, but never your father's brother's child or your mother's sister's child. To modern ears, that sounds needlessly complicated, but it's actually an elegant piece of social math. These systems, studied extensively by anthropologists like Claude Levi-Strauss, functioned as marriage law. They guaranteed that every generation, new bonds were formed between specific families in specific directions, creating a web of obligation and alliance that held multiple bands together over time. Marriage wasn't a private matter between two people. It was infrastructure. Now let's talk about the genetics, because this isn't just anthropological theory. It shows up directly in ancient DNA. In 2017, researchers analyzed the remains of people buried at Sungir, a roughly 34,000-year-old site in Russia, containing some of the most elaborate Ice Age burials ever found. Scientists sequenced the DNA of several individuals buried there and found something remarkable. Despite living in what looks like a single, small community, none of them were closely related. No parent-child pairs, no siblings mating with siblings, not even close cousins. The researchers concluded that these Ice Age humans were almost certainly practicing deliberate exogamy, seeking partners from other bands as a matter of course, likely guided by kinship rules passed down through generations. In other words, 34,000 years ago, people already understood, without any concept of DNA or genetics, that marrying outside your immediate group kept a population healthy. They just called it tradition. So if you weren't choosing based on love, who was choosing, and based on what? In most documented hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, marriages were arranged, or at minimum heavily guided by parents, elders, or the band as a whole. And the criteria weren't about chemistry. They were about capability and alliance. Could this person hunt, gather, and provide? Did their family have a good relationship with yours? Would this marriage strengthen ties between two bands who might need to share resources during a bad season or fight together against a threat? A marriage wasn't just joining two people. It was joining two support networks. In a world with no hospitals, no police, no government safety net, your survival depended entirely on how many people considered you family. Marriage was one of the most powerful tools available for expanding that number. This is also why marriage so often crossed band lines geographically. Anthropological studies of groups like the Juhoansi in the Kalahari and indigenous Australian communities have documented that marriage frequently linked people from bands separated by considerable distance. That distance wasn't an accident, it was the point. A daughter married into a distant band meant your family now had a foothold and a favor owed, hundreds of kilometers away. If your own territory failed you, drought, conflict, a bad hunting season, you had somewhere to go, and someone obligated to take you in. Then, around 10,000 years ago, something changed everything: agriculture, and with it, property. For the first time in human history, people could accumulate wealth that stayed in one place: land, livestock, stored grain, permanent structures. And suddenly, marriage had a new job. It wasn't just about alliance and survival anymore. It was about controlling who inherited what. Farming societies developed much stricter rules around marriage, often tied directly to protecting land and lineage. Dowries and bride prices became common, essentially formal negotiations where marriage functioned almost like a financial contract between families. In many early agricultural and later classical civilizations, marriage among the wealthy became explicitly transactional, arranged to consolidate land, cement political alliances, or settle debts. Love wasn't part of the equation. It wasn't even really the goal. This is the version of marriage that dominated most of recorded history. Ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman marriages were, for the vast majority of people, arranged unions built around family interest, property, and social standing. Royal marriages took this to the extreme. Entire kingdoms bound together through a single wedding, alliances that could prevent or trigger wars. The historian Stephanie Kuntz, who has written extensively on the history of marriage, has pointed out that for most of human history, marrying for love was considered, at best, a lucky accident, and at worst, actively foolish. Choosing a spouse based on romantic feeling, rather than practical benefit to your family, was seen by many historical societies as a real threat to social stability. So, when did love actually enter the picture? The shift is more recent than most people realize. Historians generally trace the rise of marrying primarily for love and personal choice to the last few centuries, closely tied to the growth of individualism, wage labor, and the decline of extended family economic dependence, particularly accelerating during and after the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America. Once people could earn a living independent of their family's land or trade, they didn't need marriage to function primarily as an economic alliance anymore. For the first time, choosing a partner based on affection rather than family strategy became not just possible, but eventually expected. What feels to us like the timeless, obvious foundation of marriage, love, is actually one of the newest ideas in the entire history of the institution. So, here's the picture that emerges when you zoom out across all of human history. For the vast majority of our existence, roughly 300,000 years, marriage wasn't about who you were drawn to, it was about who you needed and who needed you. It was a survival tool, disguised as a relationship, a way of stitching small, vulnerable groups of humans into a larger, more resilient web. The incest taboo protected the gene pool. Exogamy protected the group. Arranged unions protected alliances, resources, and inheritance. Every rule, every restriction, every seemingly rigid tradition around who could marry whom existed because human survival depended on getting this one decision right, again and again, for thousands of generations. Go back to that 19-year-old in the valley, waiting for a stranger to arrive. It's easy from here to see that as cold or even tragic. But to her, and to nearly everyone who lived before the last few hundred years, that arrangement wasn't a loss of choice. It was the choice, the one her entire community had been making, generation after generation, to make sure everyone survived. We got the version of marriage where you get to choose who you love. They got the version where love was the least important part of a decision that kept their whole world alive. Both versions worked. We just forgot how recent and how rare ours actually is.